At 5:08 on a Thursday evening, Calvin Price turned the key on his Case IH8250 combine and got one small click. No Pro 700 screen, no dash sweep, no fault code, no engine controller wake-up. Just 40 tons of red iron sitting dead at the edge of 142 acres of soybeans, while the weather app kept repeating the same ugly promise: rain before sunrise Saturday. Calvin kept his fingers on the key longer than he should have, as if the machine might change its mind. It did not. The cab stayed black. The relay clicked once. Then everything went quiet, except for the dry pods snapping in the wind. The combine had been perfect all afternoon. No stutter, no derate, no warning light, no smoke, nothing that made a man climb down and grab a flashlight. But 4 minutes before the cab died, Calvin remembered one thing. A smell. Not burnt rubber, not diesel, not the heavy stink of a shorted wire. It was sharper than that. Hot copper. Cooked grease. The kind of smell so small you almost ignore it, until the machine is already silent. He climbed down, brushed soybean dust off his sleeves, and called Northline Equipment. The service writer pulled up his customer number and gave him the first bad answer. Earliest field diagnostic was Monday afternoon. The service truck would be $495 before a panel came off. Diagnostic labor was $170 an hour. If they had to send a second tech, that time would stack. Then Calvin described the symptoms. Dead cab, starter relay click, no controller communication, no visible fuse failure. The typing stopped. The service writer was quiet for 2 seconds too long. Then he said, "That sounds like a main power harness issue." Calvin looked back at the red combine sitting beside the standing beans. What does that mean? It means the certified repair path is a harness replacement. We don't support partial harness repair in the field on that series. How much? The answer came back clean and official. Parts estimate, $4,875. Labor estimate, 11.7 hours. Field call and diagnostic separate. Total, before tax, $6,939. And because harvest calls were backed up across 3 counties, the dealership could diagnose Monday, order what they needed, and maybe get him back running late the next week. Calvin did not say anything for a moment. One click, one black screen. 142 acres still standing. Rain 31 hours away. And an official answer that sounded like nearly $7,000 and a lost week. He asked, "Can a tech walk me through checking power at the controller?" The service writer lowered his voice, not unkindly. "Calvin, I can't authorize that. The correct path is replacement." "The whole harness?" "That's the path we can stand behind." Calvin thanked him, ended the call, and drove home without turning on the radio. His wife, Ruth, was at the kitchen table with grain tickets, a farm notebook, and a calculator that had already seen too much bad news that month. She looked at his face before she looked at the keys in his hand. How dead? Calvin set the keys beside the salt shaker. Dealer says main harness, $6,939 before tax. Monday, just to start looking. Ruth did not reach for the calculator. She looked out the kitchen window toward the east field and said, "Call Ellis Ward." Calvin rubbed his forehead. "Ellis is retired." "I did not say Ellis." Calvin looked up. Ruth turned the pencil in her fingers. "I mean his niece." Calvin almost laughed, but he knew better. "Sadie? She won regional ag mechanics last spring. Ellis says she can read wiring diagrams like a second language. She is 16. Ruth pushed the notebook away. "And the combine is dead." Calvin looked toward the window again. The machine was too far away to see, but he could feel it sitting there. A red wall between him and the weather. Ruth said, "You are allowed one sentence about her age. You already used it." So Calvin called Ellis Ward. Ellis answered on the second ring, like retired mechanics do when harvest is in trouble. Calvin explained the click, the dark cab, the quote, and the smell. Ellis did not interrupt. When Calvin finished, Ellis said, "Sadie can be there after chores." "Ellis, this is an 8250. "She knows. It is not a lawnmower." "She knows that too." "Has she worked on one?" "She studied that exact power distribution layout for competition. If the harness is cooked, she will tell you. If it is one bad connection hiding inside a plug, she will find that first." Calvin exhaled through his nose. "What time?" 7 tomorrow morning. Do not keep trying the key." At 6:54 Friday morning, Ellis Ward's faded blue pickup rolled into the lane with a toolbox in the bed and a 16-year-old girl in a Navy FFA jacket sitting in the passenger seat. Sadie Ward climbed out wearing scuffed work boots, a ball cap, and leather gloves tucked into her back pocket. Under one arm, she carried a black meter case. In her other hand was a plastic folder with printed schematics clipped together. She shook Calvin's hand firmly. "Mr. Price." "Sadie." "My uncle said the cab went dark while the machine was hot, not after sitting overnight." "That's right. And you smelled something like hot pennies before it died?" Calvin stared at her. "That is exactly what I told him." Sadie nodded. "Then I want to start at the controller feed, not at the batteries." Calvin waited for more. She gave it. "If a cable is open near the battery, you usually lose everything clean. If a terminal goes high resistance under load, it can heat the connector enough to drop reference voltage without blowing a fuse. The cab looks dead because the controller never wakes up." Calvin looked at Ellis. Ellis only smiled at the gravel. They drove out to the east field in Calvin's pickup, 3 across, with Sadie in the middle seat, already turning pages. Calvin glanced down at the schematic. "Where did you get that?" Our chapter has training access through the Ag Mechanics program. I printed the 250 series power and controller diagrams last night.
Well, how much does that cost? Chapter dues are $30. The diagrams come through the program. Calvin thought about the phrase the service writer had used, certified repair path. Then he looked at the folder on Sadie's knees. $30 worth of paper was about to argue with a $7,000 answer. They reached the combine at 7:18. The sky was pale gray. The beans were dry enough to rattle. The machine looked impossibly large to be stopped by something no one could see. Sadie climbed into the cab and turned the key once. Click. No screen, no sweep. She did not try again. Good, she said. Calvin almost laughed. Good? The failures stayed failed. Intermittent problems eat daylight. She climbed down, opened the lower service panel, and studied the harness path before touching a tool. That was the first thing Calvin noticed. She did not attack the machine. She read it. She followed the cable loom with her finger. She checked the battery feed. She verified ground. She pulled no wires harder than necessary. She did not guess because guessing looked faster. Battery side is alive, she said. Relay proves that. Cab side is not waking. I want connector C312 first. Calvin frowned. You know the connector number? Sadie tapped the schematic. The machine knows its own map. Connector C312 sat tucked behind a shield below the cab floor, high enough to collect dust, low enough to catch damp air on cold mornings, and awkward enough that most people would resent it before they opened it. Sadie did not resent it. She brushed chaff away with a paintbrush, released the latch, and separated the connector carefully. For half a second, she froze. Calvin saw it. What? B7. She turned the connector toward him. Most of the terminals were clean brass. One was different. It was not melted. It was not black. It was not dramatic enough to impress anyone who wanted a broken part to look guilty. It was just dull, heat-stained, a little darker than the pins beside it. Sadie clipped her meter leads and checked the neighboring terminal first. 0.02 ohms. Then she checked B7. The meter climbed, settled, and held. 3.9 ohms. Calvin stared at the screen. Sadie said, "That terminal has almost 200 times the resistance of the one beside it." Ellis leaned closer, but did not touch anything. Sadie kept her voice steady. "That little bit of resistance turns into heat when the machine is working. Heat thins the dielectric grease. Dust gets in. The contact loses tension. Then voltage drops just enough that the controller goes blind." Calvin pointed at the harness running up into the machine. "So it is not the whole harness?" "No, sir." "How much is that terminal?" Sadie checked the connector kit in her case. "If I can retension it and clean the contact face, basically grease and time. If I replace it, the terminal is $14 and some change." Calvin looked at the combine, then at the field.
then at Sadie. The quote was 6,939. Sadie did not grin. She did not roll her eyes. She did not say what a less disciplined person would have said. She only answered, "They quoted the path they are allowed to warranty. I am testing the circuit that failed." That sentence stayed with Calvin, not because it sounded clever, because it explained the whole difference between replacing a system and understanding one. Sadie used a terminal release tool, removed B7, cleaned the contact face, compared the spring tension against a new terminal, then replaced it anyway because the contact had lost too much grip. She cleaned the connector cavity. She checked the other cavities for heat tracks. She added fresh dielectric grease. Then she tested all 24 positions before closing the plug. Calvin checked his watch. From the moment she opened the connector to the moment she latched it shut, 22 minutes had passed. Sadie stood back. "Try it now." Calvin climbed the ladder slower than he needed to. For the first time since the machine died, he was afraid of the key. Not because he thought it would fail, because if it started, he would have to admit how close he had come to paying $7,000 for the wrong truth. He turned the key. The diesel woke up. The monitor flashed. The controller came online. The diesel rolled twice, caught, and settled into a steady idle that sounded better than any song Calvin had ever heard. Sadie stood beside the front tire and let out one quiet breath. Ellis looked down and wiped his glasses with a shop rag. Calvin shut the engine down, climbed out, and reached for his checkbook. "What do I owe you?" Sadie shook her head immediately. "I can't charge. It counts as chapter community service if I log the diagnostic." "Then your chapter can take a donation." Sadie looked uncomfortable in the exact way good kids look uncomfortable when gratitude gets too close. "Anything helps." Calvin opened the checkbook on the hood of the pickup. "What is the shop trying to buy?" Sadie hesitated. "A diagnostic trainer, better meters, connector kits, heat shrink station. The whole list is our annual goal." "How much?" She looked at Ellis. Ellis answered for her. $4,875. Calvin looked up. "The harness part." Ellis nodded. Calvin wrote the check. Red Willow FFA. $4,875. Sadie stared at it. "Mr. Price, that is the whole goal." Calvin tore the check free. "No, that is the part I did not need." By 8:40 that morning, the combine was back in beans. By Friday night, Calvin had cleared 86 acres. At 1:12 Saturday morning, he finished the east field under work lights with dust hanging in the air like smoke. At 4:37, rain hit the machine shed roof so hard Ruth woke up and thought hail had started. Calvin stood in the doorway with a coffee cup in his hand, watching water run off the header. He kept thinking about the black screen, the official quote, the tiny heat-stained terminal, and a 16-year-old who had not argued with a dealership
not mocked a mechanic, not acted like a hero. She had simply followed voltage until the machine stopped lying. 3 days later, Calvin's neighbor, Dean Harlow, called. "I heard you let a high school girl work on that 8250. Calvin looked at the combine parked clean in the shed. "I let a regional ag mechanics champion test a failed circuit." "She could have fried something." "She did not power anything. She measured resistance." "Dealers replace whole harnesses for liability." "I know why they do it." "Then maybe they were right." Calvin let the silence sit for a moment. "Dean, that machine has run 53 hours since Sadie fixed it. No flicker, no code, no derate." "That does not make her certified." "No," Calvin said. "It makes her right." There was another silence. Calvin did not fill that one either. In November, Red Willow FFA held its harvest supper in the high school cafeteria. The shop advisor stood at the front with a microphone that squealed twice before he got it working. He told the room the Ag Mechanics Fund had been met in a single donation for the first time anyone could remember. Then he called Sadie Ward forward. She walked up in the same navy jacket, took a small plaque shaped like an FFA shield, and looked more nervous under applause than she had looked under a dead combine. Calvin and Ruth sat 3 rows back beside Ellis. Ruth leaned toward Calvin and whispered, "She still hates being looked at." Calvin whispered back, "Good. Means she will keep looking at the work." After the supper, Calvin found Sadie near the coffee urns. "Sadie?" "Mr. Price?" "You still got that terminal?" She reached into the pocket of her jacket and pulled out a clear parts bag. Inside was the small brass terminal, labeled in blue ink. Case IH8250. Connector C312. Pin B7. High resistance. October harvest failure. Calvin held the bag up to the fluorescent light. It looked like almost nothing. A scrap of brass small enough to lose in gravel. Too small to stop a machine. Too small to threaten a crop. Too small to make a grown man believe a $7,000 repair was the only answer. But it had done all of that. Calvin handed it back. "You know what that terminal is worth?" Sadie looked at the bag. $14 and some change. Calvin shook his head. "That terminal is worth every kid in this room learning where to put a meter before they price a harness." Sadie looked down at the label. Then she said, "I am writing that down." Ruth stepped beside them, smiling. "Write the rest, too." Sadie looked up. "What rest?" Calvin nodded toward the parts bag. "Some people replace the whole harness because they never find the bad terminal." Sadie waited. Calvin tapped the plastic with one finger. "And some people find the bad terminal, save the harvest, and use the money to teach the next kid how to look." Outside, rainwater from the week before had dried into pale mud along the school parking lot. Inside, Sadie walked back to the FFA table, opened her notebook, and drew connector C312 from memory.
3 younger members leaned over the page. She marked pin B7. She wrote the meter reading. Then she wrote the sentence Calvin had given her. And by the end of that night, the tiny brass terminal had become exactly what it should have been all along. Not a $7,000 harness. A lesson with evidence.